Exhaustion hung on Syra Morris, like a lead apron, as she pushed through the reinforced steel doors of ironclad munitions. Still wearing her faded blue scrubs, smelling faintly of clinical sanitizer and a brutal 14-hour trauma shift, she looked entirely out of place. 3 tactical gear-clad men snickering by the display cases instantly pegged her as a soft target, a delicate, lost little nurse, stumbling blindly into a hardened man's world. They puffed out their chests, laughing as they prepared to teach her a humiliating lesson. They had absolutely no idea they were mocking a decorated former JSOC combat medic, and they certainly didn't know she owned the shop. The fluorescent lights of St. Jude's Medical Center hummed with a persistent, maddening buzz that Syra Morris usually tuned out. Today, however, the sound felt like a drill pressing against her temples. It had been a brutal 14-hour shift in the emergency department. She had seen 2 multi-vehicle pileups, a severe industrial accident, and the usual endless stream of minor, panic-driven ailments. Through it all, Syra had moved with a mechanical, terrifying efficiency. Where junior nurses panicked at the sight of arterial spray, Syra simply applied pressure, her hands steady, her heart rate never spiking above 80 beats per minute. She was 34 years old, with sharp features, a messy bun of dark brown hair, and eyes the color of winter ice. Her scrubs were a nondescript navy blue, currently stained with a faint, washed-out smear of betadine near the hem. To the world, she was just a senior trauma nurse, capable, perhaps a bit emotionally distant, but thoroughly ordinary. As she clocked out and walked into the biting November wind of Chicago, Syra didn't head home. She bypassed her small, quiet apartment and steered her 10-year-old sedan toward the industrial district on the edge of the city. She had a promise to keep and a pickup to make. The building was a sprawling, windowless brick structure that looked more like an abandoned warehouse than a retail establishment. A heavy, wrought iron sign hung above the steel-reinforced door. Ironclad Munitions. It was a high-end firearms dealer and custom gunsmithing shop, catering not just to civilian enthusiasts, but to private security firms and specialized law enforcement units. Syra pushed the heavy door open, stepping out of the freezing wind and into a wave of warm air that smelled intensely of Hoppy's No-Bird 9 solvent, machined steel, and aged leather. It was a smell that instantly bypassed her exhaustion, triggering an old, deeply buried part of her brain. Her posture changed immediately. The slight, tired slump of her shoulders vanished. Her spine straightened, her chin lifted, and her eyes began a passive but thorough sweep of the room, noting the exits, the blind spots, and the occupants. The shop was relatively quiet. Behind the long, polished oak counter, lined with glass display cases, a young clerk named Toby was furiously polishing a display model. But Syra's attention was immediately drawn to the center of the showroom. Standing by a rack of customized tactical rifles were 3 men. They were in their late 20s or early 30s, dressed in an over-the-top array of tactical clothing, khaki cargo pants, coyote tan operator boots, and tight black t-shirts that strained against their gym-sculpted biceps. They wore expensive, brand-new wraparound sunglasses perched on the backs of their necks and sported neatly trimmed beards. To an untrained eye, they looked like hardened mercenaries. To Syra, they looked like expensive airsoft players. The loudest of them, a broad-shouldered man named Chad Miller, was currently holding a heavily modified AR-15 platform, gesturing wildly with it as he spoke to his friends. His finger hovered perilously close to the trigger guard, and the muzzle was pointed haphazardly toward the front door. Syra felt a familiar, cold irritation flare in her chest at the blatant lack of muzzle discipline. As the door swung shut behind her, the heavy thud drew the attention of the 3 men. Chad paused mid-sentence, lowering the rifle slightly. His gaze swept over Syra, taking in her navy blue scrubs, her sensible white nursing clogs, and the tired, makeup-free exhaustion on her face. A slow, mocking smirk spread across Chad's face. He nudged the man next to him, Brody Higgins, a shorter, stockier man, wearing a baseball cap with a prominent Punisher skull patch. "Well, look what the wind blew in," Chad said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Think she took a wrong turn at the pharmacy?" Brody chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "Probably looking for the uniform shop. Or maybe she needs directions to the nearest hospital." Syra didn't flinch. She had spent a decade in environments so hostile and unforgiving that the taunts of weekend warriors barely registered on her emotional radar. She ignored them entirely, making her way toward the far end of the counter. Specifically, the section that housed high-end, long-range optics and precision rifle components. She rested her hands on the glass, peering down at a newly arrived shipment of Schmidt and Bender scopes. She needed a very specific piece of glass for a custom build she was working on, something capable of handling the recoil of a 338 Lapua Magnum without losing zero. "Hey, Toby," Syra called out mildly, her voice smooth and devoid of intimidation. "Is Artie in the back?" Toby looked up, his eyes widening in recognition. "Oh, hey, Syra. Yeah, Mr. Walsh is in the machine shop. He said he'd be out in a few minutes. He's just finishing up a threading job on a barrel. Do you want me to go get him?" "No, let him finish," Syra said, leaning against the counter. "I've got time." Across the room, Chad and Brody exchanged a look. The fact that the little nurse knew the owner's name seemed to amuse them even more. To them, she wasn't a peer. She was a novelty. And men like Chad Miller rarely let a novelty go unbothered. Chad handed the rifle back to his third companion and swaggered over toward Syra, his boots thudding loudly against the concrete floor. Brody followed a step behind, acting as an eager wingman to the impending harassment. "You lost, sweetheart?" Chad asked as he stopped a few feet away, invading her personal space just enough to be aggressive without being physically threatening. Syra didn't look up from the display case. "I know exactly where I am. Thank you." "Yeah? Because this isn't exactly a place for picking up stethoscopes and Band-Aids," Chad sneered, leaning his elbow on the glass counter right next to her hand. "You realize what kind of store this is, right? We deal with serious hardware here. Not exactly the kind of stuff they teach you to handle in nursing school." Syra finally turned her head to look at him. Her expression was entirely blank. No fear, no annoyance, just a cold, clinical observation. She looked at him the same way she looked at a minor laceration that required 3 stitches routine, unimpressive and slightly tedious. "I'm aware," Syra said quietly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm trying to look at the inventory." Chad scoffed, shaking his head. "Inventory? Right. Look, honey, if you're looking for something for personal protection, you're in the wrong section." He pointed a thick finger at the massive precision scopes beneath the glass. "That stuff right there? That's for men who know how to reach out and touch something at 1,000 yards. You don't even know what you're looking at." The fluorescent lights of the gun shop reflected off the pristine glass display cases, casting harsh shadows across Chad Miller's smug face. Syra remained perfectly still, her hands resting lightly on her thighs. She had spent years mastering the art of controlled breathing, slowing her heart rate in the face of incoming mortar fire, catastrophic trauma, and agonizing pain. Chad's arrogant posturing was barely a blip on her internal radar. "I appreciate your concern," Syra said, her voice a flat, emotionless monotone. "But I'm fine right here." Brody stepped up beside Chad, crossing his arms over his chest to accentuate his biceps. "Come on, Chad. She's just looking at the shiny things. Let her dream." He looked down at Syra with a patronizing grin. "Tell you what, little lady, if you really want something to make you feel safe walking to your car after your little nursing shifts, we can ask the kid behind the counter to show you the pepper spray." Chad laughed loudly. "Or better yet, they've got those cute little pink revolvers in the front case. A little 38 special. Snub nose. You just point and pull the trigger. No complicated moving parts for you to worry about. We could even show you how to hold it so you don't break your wrist." Behind the counter, Toby, the young clerk, shifted uncomfortably. He opened his mouth to intervene, knowing full well who Syra was. But Syra shot him a sharp, infinitesimal look, a tiny shake of her head. "Stay out of it." Toby swallowed hard and busied himself with a pile of receipts, pretending he was deaf. Syra turned her body fully toward the two men. She looked at Chad's expensive tactical belt, noting the pristine, unscuffed holster housing a high-end, customized Glock. She noticed how stiff his rig was. It hadn't been broken in. He had never rolled in the dirt with it, never had to draw it under pressure, never sweat into the nylon until it smelled like fear and adrenaline. It was costume jewelry for fragile egos. "A 38 snub-nose," Syra repeated, her tone conversational. "Short barrel, terrible sight radius, snappy recoil due to the lightweight frame, making follow-up shots incredibly difficult for an inexperienced shooter. In a high-stress scenario, adrenaline degrades fine motor skills, making a heavy double-action trigger pull detrimental to accuracy. If you were actually trying to advise a novice, you'd suggest a compact 9mm with a striker-fired mechanism and a weapon-mounted light. But you aren't trying to be helpful, are you? You're just trying to be loud." For a split second, the smug smile slid right off Chad's face. Brody blinked, clearly confused by the sudden spew of technical jargon coming from the exhausted woman in hospital scrubs. But ego is a stubborn thing, and Chad recovered quickly, masking his surprise with an aggressive scoff. "Wow, somebody read a Wikipedia article," Chad mocked, though his voice had lost a fraction of its booming confidence. "Memorizing a few words doesn't mean you know how to shoot, sweetheart. I run 3-gun competitions every weekend. I've put thousands of rounds downrange. You read a magazine." "Fascinating," Syra said deadpan. She turned her back to him, pointing down at the display case. "Toby, can you pull out the PM2525X56, the one with the Tremor 3 reticle?" Toby scrambled to unlock the case, carefully lifting out the massive, heavy, matte black optical sight. He set it gently on the felt pad on top of the counter. It was a piece of equipment that cost upwards of $4,000, used almost exclusively by military snipers and extreme long-range competitors. Chad leaned over, invading her space again, staring at the scope. "Are you kidding me? Do you even know what that costs? That's not a toy, lady. That's a Schmidt and Bender. You don't just mount that on a hunting rifle to shoot deer at 50 yards. "I am aware of what it is," Syra said, picking up the heavy scope with one hand. She checked the turrets, feeling the crisp, tactile clicks of the elevation knob. "It's for a 300 PRC build. Need reliable tracking for engagements past 1,200 meters." Brody let out a loud, mocking guffaw. 1,200 meters? You? Yeah, right. I bet you couldn't hit a barn from the inside. Listen, lady, stop wasting the shop's time. Why don't you go back to the hospital and hand out some aspirin? Leave the serious hardware to the men." Syra slowly lowered the scope back onto the felt pad. The air around her seemed to drop by several degrees. The exhaustion that had weighed her down since she walked out of the ER evaporated, replaced by a terrifying, hyper-focused stillness. She turned to look at Brody. She didn't glare. She didn't scowl. She just looked at him with an expression of such profound, predatory emptiness that Brody instinctively took a half step backward. "I hand out a lot more than aspirin," Syra said softly, her voice carrying a chillingly quiet resonance in the large room. "Usually, I'm the one trying to stop the bleeding after arrogant men like you overestimate their capabilities and shoot themselves or someone else on the range. Now, step back." Chad's face flushed a deep, ugly red. His ego, fragile beneath the tactical nylon, couldn't handle being spoken to like a child by a woman in scrubs. He closed the distance between them, towering over Syra, trying to use his physical size to intimidate her. "Listen to me, you arrogant little B times Chach," Chad hissed, dropping all pretense of playful mockery. "I don't care what you do for a living. You don't come in here acting like you own the place. You're a nurse. You wipe asses and change bedpans. This is a gun shop. We deal in life and death here." The silence that followed Chad's outburst was deafening. The ambient noise of the shop, the hum of the HVAC, the distant whine of a lathe from the back room seemed to instantly vanish. Toby, the clerk, went completely rigid. The color drained entirely from his young face. He wasn't looking at Chad. He was staring in absolute horror at Syra. Syra did not step back. She didn't shrink away from Chad's aggressive posture. Instead, she leaned in slightly. The shift in her body mechanics was imperceptible to the untrained eye, but she was suddenly balanced perfectly on the balls of her feet, her center of gravity lowered, her hands loose and ready by her sides. She had transitioned from a tired civilian to a lethal weapon in less than a second. "Life and death," Syra repeated, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Memories she usually kept locked behind reinforced mental doors began to rattle their cages. Life and death. She remembered the metallic smell of blood in the back of a Black Hawk helicopter over the Korengal Valley. She remembered the frantic, slippery feel of trying to pack a catastrophic femoral artery wound, while incoming fire peppered the fuselage. She remembered holding the hands of young men younger and far braver than Chad Miller, as the light faded from their eyes. She had bathed in life and death for 10 years in the shadows. You think wearing tactical pants and shooting paper targets on a sunny Saturday makes you an expert on life and death? Syra's voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the room like a scalpel. Chad smirked, misinterpreting her quiet tone for submission. "I think you need to take a walk, sweetheart, before you embarrass yourself further. This isn't a toy store. B times teach. Go back to your lane." Syra's eyes darkened. "Not a toy store." "That's right," Brody chimed in, stepping forward again to support his friend, emboldened by Chad's aggression. "Go on. Beat it. The men are talking." Before Syra could move, before she could unleash the decade of close-quarters combat training that was screaming to be let off the leash, a heavy, metallic CLA echoed through the shop. The heavy steel security door leading to the back machine shop had been kicked open. It hit the concrete wall with enough force to shake the framing. Standing in the doorway was Alva Walsh. Alva was a giant of a man in his late 50s. He was built like a cinder block wall, with thick forearms covered in fading, jagged scars, and grease. He wore a heavy leather shop apron over a faded green flannel shirt. A thick, gray beard obscured the lower half of his face, but there was no mistaking the raw, unadulterated fury in his dark eyes. Alva was a former Marine Force recon operator who had transitioned into private military contracting before opening the shop. He was not a man who tolerated foolishness. He held a heavy steel wrench in one hand, his knuckles white with tension. Chad and Brody turned toward the noise, their smug expressions faltering slightly at the sight of the intimidating owner. Chad quickly plastered on a friendly, bro-to-bro smile. "Hey, Artie," Chad called out loudly, trying to assert a familiarity he didn't actually possess. "Good to see you, man. We were just checking out the new inventory, having a little trouble with the local wildlife, though." He jerked a thumb dismissively toward Syra. "You might want to tighten up security. Letting confused nurses wander in off the street isn't great for business." Alva didn't say a word. He didn't smile. He walked slowly out from behind the counter, his heavy boots making slow, deliberate sounds on the concrete. The atmosphere in the room grew suffocatingly dense. Chad's smile began to slip. He looked at Brody, then back to Alva. Artie? You good, man?" Alva stopped a few feet away from Chad. He didn't look at the tactical gear. He didn't look at the expensive rifles. He looked dead into Chad's eyes. "My name," Alva rumbled, his voice like gravel being crushed under a tire, "is Alva. Only my friends call me Artie. And you, son, are no friend of mine." Chad swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Hey, man, I spend a lot of money in here." "I don't give a damn about your money," Alva interrupted, his voice rising in volume, echoing off the high ceiling. He pointed a thick, grease-stained finger directly at Chad's chest. I want you to tell me exactly what you just said to her. Chad blinked, genuinely confused. He glanced at Syra, who was watching the scene unfold with absolute detachment. Her? The nurse? Look, she was just mouthing off, acting like she knew something about high-end optics. I just told her to stay in her lane. You know how it is. I know how it is, Alva repeated, taking another step forward, forcing Chad to instinctively back up. You called my establishment a toy store. You insulted my customer. And from the sounds of it, you threatened her. I didn't threaten anybody, Chad said defensively, his hands coming up in a placating gesture. I just told her, this ain't a place for little nurses to play make-believe. Come on, Alva. You know the type. Thinks because she put a Band-Aid on a paper cut she's hardcore. Alva turned his head slowly and looked at Syra. The pure rage in his eyes vanished instantly, replaced by a look of deep, unconditional respect. He looked at her navy blue scrubs, at the tired lines around her eyes, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Syra, Alva said softly. Are you all right? Chad scoffed loudly. Are you seriously asking her? Shut your mouth, Alva roared, spinning back toward Chad with such ferocity that both Chad and Brody visibly jumped. The wrench in Alva's hand twitched. You stand in my shop, you breathe my air, and you insult the woman who dragged my only son for 3 miles through a live minefield in Helmand Province while she was bleeding from a gunshot wound to the shoulder. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Chad stared at Alva, his brain struggling to process the information. He looked from the massive, furious gunsmith back to the small woman in the faded blue hospital scrubs. What? Brody whispered, his face going pale. You think you're operators because you bought some fancy pants and shoot static targets, Alva growled, stepping so close to Chad that he could have headbutted him. You just told a Silver Star recipient, a former Tier 1 JSOC combat medic, and the best long-range shooter I have ever met in my miserable life, that she belongs in a toy store. Alva slowly raised his hand and pointed a thick, trembling finger at the front door. Now, Alva whispered, his voice vibrating with lethal intent, I am going to give you exactly 5 seconds to get out of my shop before I show you what real trauma looks like. The silence in ironclad munitions was no longer just quiet. It was suffocating. The air seemed to have thickened, pressing in on Chad Miller and Brody Higgins from all sides. Alva Walsh's words echoed off the steel-reinforced walls, each syllable a heavy hammer blow to the fragile, tactical nylon-wrapped egos of the weekend warriors. JSOC, combat medic, Silver Star, best long-range shooter. Chad's mouth opened and closed twice, but no sound came out. The blood had completely drained from his face, leaving a sickly, pale sheen of sweat on his forehead. He looked at Syra again, really looked at her this time. He didn't see the faded scrubs or the messy bun anymore. He saw the terrifying stillness in her posture. He noticed the way her hands rested loosely at her sides, perfectly relaxed, but positioned for immediate, explosive action. He saw the cold, dead-eyed stare of someone who had looked into the abyss and learned how to make the abyss blink first. 5. Alva boomed, shattering the silence. He didn't raise his wrench, but his grip tightened until the leather of his glove creaked. Brody, who had been hiding behind Chad's bravado, suddenly found his legs. He scrambled backward, his heavy boots squeaking awkwardly on the polished concrete. He bumped into the third member of their group, who had remained entirely silent and was already backing toward the exit. Hey man, we're going, Brody stammered, his voice cracking by a full octave. No problem. We didn't know. 4. Alva continued, stepping forward. His massive frame blocked out the overhead fluorescent lights, casting a long, terrifying shadow over the 3 men. Chad finally found his voice, though it lacked any of its previous booming arrogance. It was thin, reedy, and laced with genuine panic. Look, Alva, Artie, sir. It was just a joke. Just shop talk. You don't need to. 3. Alva's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. That was all it took. The illusion of their rugged, operator personas shattered completely. Chad spun on his heel, abandoning whatever pride he had left, and practically sprinted for the front door. Brody and the third man were right on his heels, shoving each other out of the way to reach the handle first. The heavy brass bell above the glass door chimed a frantic, chaotic melody as the three men tumbled out into the freezing Chicago wind. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind them with a definitive thud, cutting off the sound of their scrambling boots. Inside the shop, the tension evaporated so quickly it almost left a vacuum. Behind the counter, young Toby let out a breath. He sounded like he had been holding for 3 minutes. He slumped against the glass display case, pressing a hand to his chest. "Holy crap, Alva. I thought you were actually going to beat him to death with a pipe wrench." Alva slowly lowered the wrench, the terrifying, murderous scowl melting off his face in an instant. He let out a long, heavy sigh, reaching up to rub the bridge of his nose with a grease-stained thumb. "I was heavily considering it, Toby. Heavily." He turned to Syra, who hadn't moved an inch. She was still staring at the front door, her expression unreadable. Alva's posture softened entirely. The intimidating behemoth vanished, replaced by a weary, deeply affectionate older man. He tossed the wrench onto a rubber mat behind the counter and walked over to her. "I'm sorry about that, Syra," Alva said gently, his gravelly voice dropping to a low, apologetic rumble. "We get these mall ninjas in here every once in a while. Watch too many movies, bought too much gear, and think they own the world. I usually try to weed them out before they bother the serious clients." Syra finally blinked, the icy distance in her eyes thawing. She let out a small, tired breath and ran a hand over her face, suddenly looking every bit of her 34 years and the exhaustion of her 14-hour shift. "It's fine, Alva," she murmured, offering him a faint, lopsided smile. "Honestly, I've had patients in the psych ward with better situational awareness. I was just ignoring him until he started giving me terrible advice on concealed carry." "A 38 snub nose? Really?" Alva barked a genuine laugh, a deep, resonant sound that warmed the room. I know. I heard that from the back. That's what actually made me grab the wrench." The sheer ignorance was offensive. Syra shook her head, leaning back against the glass display case. The adrenaline that had briefly spiked in her system was beginning to fade, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep ache in her muscles. Alva watched her closely, his eyes filled with a paternal concern. "Long shift at Street Jude's?" 14 hours, Syra confirmed, rubbing the back of her neck. "Pile up on I-90. 3 criticals. Spent 6 hours in the OR trying to piece a teenager's femur back together. The last thing I wanted to deal with today was a man named Chad explaining trigger pull to me." "You shouldn't have to," Alva said firmly. He gestured toward the back of the shop, where the heavy steel door he had kicked open still stood ajar. "Come on back. Daniel just brewed a fresh pot of the dark roast you like. And we need to go over the quarterly numbers anyway." Toby, who had been quietly organizing receipts, froze again. He looked from Alva to Syra, a look of utter bewilderment on his face. He knew Syra was a friend of Alva's, a highly decorated veteran, and a regular in the shop. He knew the story of how she had saved Alva's son, Daniel, in Afghanistan, but he didn't know anything about numbers. Syra noticed Toby's confusion. She pushed herself off the counter, picking up the heavy Schmidt and Bender scope she had been examining earlier. "Thanks, Toby," Syra said to the young clerk, her voice professional and kind. "I'll take this into the back. Put it on the master ledger." Toby nodded dumbly. "Yes, ma'am. Master ledger." Alva stepped aside, allowing Syra to walk ahead of him toward the machine shop. As she passed, he placed a gentle, respectful hand on her shoulder. They walked through the heavy steel door, leaving the pristine showroom behind. The back of the shop was a completely different world. It was a chaotic symphony of precision machinery. CNC mills hummed quietly. Drill presses stood like metal sentinels, and the air was thick with the sharp, metallic tang of cutting fluid and gun oil. In the center of the room, standing over a massive, custom-built workbench, was Daniel Walsh. He was a younger, leaner version of his father, with the same dark eyes but a jagged, the permanent scar that ran from his jawline down into the collar of his shirt. A permanent reminder of the day Syra had refused to let him die in the dirt of the Korengal Valley. Daniel looked up as they entered, a bright, genuine smile breaking across his face. He wiped his greasy hands on a rag and limped slightly as he walked over to the coffee pot. "Hey, boss," Daniel said warmly, pouring a steaming cup of pitch-black coffee and holding it out to Syra. "Heard Dad yelling. Did someone touch the display models without asking again?" Syra took the mug, wrapping her cold hands around the hot ceramic. She took a deep sip, closing her eyes as the caffeine hit her system. "Worse. Someone tried to tell me I belong in a toy store." Daniel winced, letting out a low whistle. "Ouch. Dad didn't kill them, did he?" "The paperwork for a body in the showroom is a nightmare. I let them live," Alva grumbled, walking over to a heavy metal filing cabinet and pulling out a thick, leather-bound ledger. He carried it over to a clean section of the workbench and flipped it open. "But only because Syra is the majority shareholder, and I know she hates dealing with the Chicago Police Department." Syra smiled, taking another sip of her coffee. To the world, Ironclad Munitions was owned and operated by Alva Walsh, a gruff, old-school gunsmith. But the truth, buried under layers of LLCs and ironclad NDAs, was entirely different. Syra Morris wasn't just a decorated combat medic. She was the sole financial backer and owner of the multi-million-dollar defense contracting and custom firearms business, and she preferred to keep it exactly that way. The machine shop was a sanctuary for Syra, while the hospital emergency room was a place of frantic, unpredictable chaos, where she desperately tried to hold broken bodies together with gauze and sheer willpower. This back room was a place of absolute precision. Here, physics ruled. Tolerances were measured in thousandths of an inch. If something was broken, it could be machined, milled, and fixed with mathematical certainty. She set her coffee mug down on a cork coaster near the CNC machine and walked over to the ledger Alva had opened. "How are we looking for Q3?" Syra asked, her demeanor shifting effortlessly from exhausted nurse to calculating CEO. Alva pulled a pair of reading glasses from his shirt pocket and perched them on his nose, instantly transforming from an intimidating brawler into a meticulous accountant. Better than projected. The new contract with the state police tactical teams cleared last week. We're outfitting their entire sniper division with the new chassis systems. Plus, the civilian custom builds are backlogged by 6 months. Syra ran her finger down the column of figures, her sharp eyes catching a slight discrepancy in the materials cost. "Titanium prices went up again?" 12%, Daniel chimed in, leaning against a drill press. "Suppliers are citing logistical issues. I've been looking into alternative vendors, but the quality control from the overseas guys just isn't there. If we're stamping the ironclad name on a suppressor, I want domestic titanium." "Agreed," Syra said without hesitation. "Don't compromise the materials. Eat the 12% for the civilian contracts, but adjust the pricing matrix for the next round of law enforcement bids to cover the difference. Our reputation is built on reliability. If a SWAT officer has a catastrophic failure because we saved a few bucks on a baffle strike, that's on us." "Already drafted the updated pricing tier," Alva said, tapping a folder beneath the ledger. "Just needed your signature." Syra reached into her scrub pocket, pulled out a cheap plastic hospital pen, and scrawled her name on the dotted line. It was a strange dichotomy, one that she lived with every day. 8 years ago, she had been medically discharged from JSOC after catching shrapnel during the same ambush that had nearly killed Daniel. She had come home with a chest full of medals, a profound case of PTSD, and a massive payout from the military and private contracting insurance. She had channeled her trauma into nursing, desperate to spend her life saving people instead of patching them up in war zones, just so they could go back out and shoot at each other. But when Alva, who had spent his life savings trying to keep Daniel alive through years of reconstructive surgeries and physical therapy, was on the verge of losing his beloved gun shop to the bank, Syra hadn't hesitated. She had walked into the bank, paid off the mortgage in cash, and pumped $3 million of her own money into upgrading the machinery and expanding the business. She became the silent partner. Alva remained the face. It was the perfect arrangement. It allowed Alva and Daniel to keep their pride and their livelihood, and it gave Syra a hidden empire where she could still connect with the only other world she truly understood. "So," Daniel said, breaking the comfortable silence. He gestured to the heavy Schmidt and Bender scopes Syra had brought in. "You brought the PM2 back. Don't tell me you're actually going to build that 300 PRC. Syra's eyes lit up, a spark of genuine excitement pushing through her exhaustion. "I am. The action arrived yesterday from Defiance. I've got a 26-inch proof research carbon fiber barrel waiting in my apartment. I'm going to thread it and chamber it myself this weekend." Alva raised an eyebrow, looking impressed. "Chambering it yourself? You haven't run the lathe in 6 months, Syra. Sure you're not rusty? It's like riding a bicycle, Alva." Syra smirked, picking up the heavy scope and admiring the optical clarity. "Except if you mess up the bicycle, it doesn't explode in your face with 60,000 psi of chamber pressure. I want this build perfect. I've got a spot booked at the Extreme Long Range facility in Wyoming next month, trying to push past 2,000 yards. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "You're a terrifying woman, Syra. You spent 14 hours today saving lives. And this weekend, you're building a rifle capable of hitting a dinner plate from 1.5 miles away. Balance, Daniel," Syra said softly, her smile fading slightly as she looked down at the cold, machined steel of the scope. "It's all about balance." Before Daniel could respond, the intercom on the wall buzzed sharply. Toby's voice crackled through the speaker, sounding slightly panicked. Alva? Syra? I'm sorry to interrupt." Alva hit the talk button. "What is it, Toby? Did Tweedledee and Tweedledum come back?" "No, sir." Toby's voice wavered. Well, there's a couple of suits out here. Federal badges. They're asking for the owner of Ironclad Munitions. By name. They're asking for Syra Morris." The relaxed atmosphere in the machine shop vanished instantly. Alva and Daniel exchanged a sharp, concerned look. The business was perfectly legal. The books were spotless, and their federal firearms licenses were meticulously maintained. There was no reason for federal agents to bypass Alva and specifically ask for the silent partner whose name wasn't on the front door. Syra's posture shifted again, the easygoing CEO disappearing, replaced by the hyper-vigilant combat veteran. She set the scope down carefully on the workbench. "Did they say what agency?" Syra asked, stepping toward the intercom. "FBI, ma'am," Toby replied. "They look serious. They said it's a matter of national security." Syra stared at the heavy steel door. Her past, it seemed, was entirely done, hiding in the shadows. "Tell them," Syra said, her voice dropping to a cool, dangerous register. "I'll be right out." Syra pushed the heavy steel door open, stepping out of the metallic sanctuary of the machine shop and back into the pristine showroom. The contrast between the two worlds always struck her, but today it felt particularly jarring. Standing near the front counter, flanking a deeply uncomfortable Toby, were two individuals who radiated institutional authority. The man was tall, sharp-featured, with a neatly trimmed salt and pepper haircut and a dark, off-the-rack suit that failed to completely hide the imprint of a shoulder holster. His partner was a woman of average height, her blonde hair pulled into a severe ponytail, wearing a tailored navy blazer and the unmistakable, calculating gaze of a seasoned federal investigator. Syra didn't offer her hand. She stopped 5 feet away, her posture relaxed but firmly anchored. Alva and Daniel filed in behind her, forming a silent, imposing wall of solidarity. "I'm Syra Morris," she said, her voice betraying none of the adrenaline spiking in her bloodstream. "You asked for me by name. To what do I owe the pleasure of the Bureau's company?" The male agent stepped forward, pulling a leather credential case from his breast pocket and flipping it open. "Special Agent Harrison Blake. This is Special Agent Sarah Jenkins, FBI, Joint Terrorism Task Force. We appreciate your time, Miss Morris. Or should I say, Sergeant First Class Morris." Syra's expression remained perfectly neutral, though a cold knot tightened in her stomach. Her military rank was buried under layers of classified JSOC operational files. For a JTTF agent to pull it casually meant they weren't here about a tax audit. "I've been a civilian for 8 years, Agent Blake," Syra replied smoothly. "And I'm currently off the clock from my civilian job. What is this about?" Agent Jenkins stepped up beside her partner, her eyes sweeping over the high-end tactical rifles in the display cases before settling on Syra. "This is about a domestic militia cell operating out of the greater Chicago area. Specifically, a splinter group calling themselves the Iron Vanguard. We've been tracking their communications for 6 months. They've moved from online radicalization to active operational planning." Alva crossed his massive arms over his chest, his leather apron creaking. "And what does a bunch of internet cosplayers have to do with my shop? We don't sell to extremists. Every single buyer goes through a rigorous background check, waiting periods, and a secondary vetting process that I handle personally. If they ping on a federal database, they don't buy a damn cleaning kit from me." "We know, Mr. Walsh," Blake said, raising a placating hand. "Ironclad munitions is spotless. In fact, your refusal to sell to certain individuals is exactly why we're here. 20 minutes ago, 3 men walked out of your store. One of them goes by the name Chad Miller." Syra's eyes narrowed slightly. The arrogant weekend warrior. The man who had mocked her scrubs and told her to buy a pink snub-nose revolver. "His real name is William Chadwick," Jenkins continued, pulling a tablet from her briefcase and bringing up a surveillance photo. It was Chad, looking considerably less smug, standing outside a heavily fortified compound in rural Illinois. "He's the operational leader of the Vanguard. He's not a hobbyist. He's a former private security contractor who was fired for excessive force and instability, and he's currently planning a mass casualty event." Daniel let out a low curse, limping forward to look at the tablet. "He was just in here, acting like a loudmouth idiot, trying to buy high-end Schmidt and Bender scopes, but Alva threw him out before he could even fill out a form." "We know," Blake said, his tone turning grim. "We had surveillance units sitting outside your shop. We saw them exit in a panic. But the problem is, Chadwick wasn't here to buy a scope for a hunting trip. Our wiretaps indicated he was looking for precision optics to set up an overwatch position for an attack scheduled for today." Syra's blood ran cold. The pieces began to violently snap together in her mind. Chadwick's arrogant posturing, his specific interest in optics, capable of extreme long-range engagements, the nervous, twitchy energy of his 2 companions. "Where?" Syra asked, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "Where is the target?" Agent Jenkins hesitated, glancing at Blake. Blake gave a curt nod. "We intercepted a scrambled text message right after they fled your store," Jenkins said, looking directly into Syra's eyes. "The rejection here spooked them. Chadwick moved the timetable up. The target is Street Jude's Medical Center, specifically the trauma wing. Chadwick's brother died there last month after a shootout with police. He blames the medical staff for not saving him." The showroom spun violently around Syra, but her feet remained planted on the concrete. Street Jude's, her hospital, the place she had just left. The emergency department was currently staffed by her closest friends, junior nurses she mentored, and doctors who had guided her through her own PTSD recovery. "They're hitting the ED," Syra stated. "Not a question, but a tactical assessment. It's a soft target, high visibility, Maximum psychological impact. The trauma bays are on the ground floor. Large glass windows, facing the south lot. If Chadwick sets up an overwatch on the parking garage across the street, he can pin down the entire first responder approach, while his team breaches the main entrance. Agent Blake stared at her, genuinely taken aback by the speed and accuracy of her tactical breakdown. That is exactly what our analyst just concluded. We have SWAT and HRT mobilizing, but they are 20 minutes out through downtown traffic. Chadwick is already en route. He's 5 minutes away. He's going to slaughter them, Syra said. The clinical detachment she used in the trauma bay, suddenly supercharged by a lethal, protective fury. The hospital security is armed with 9mm sidearms and soft body armor. Chadwick's crew will be running level IV plates and intermediate caliber rifles. It'll be a massacre before your HRT even gets off the highway. Alva didn't say a word. He simply turned around, walked to the heaviest, most secure safe behind the counter, and punched in a rapid 8-digit code. The massive steel bolts retracted with a heavy clunk. He swung the door open and pulled out a sleek, matte black Pelican case. He slammed it onto the glass counter and popped the latches. Inside lay a heavily modified, suppressed 300 blackout short-barreled rifle. It was a close-quarters weapon designed for devastating kinetic energy at close range, equipped with an EO-Tech holographic sight and a tactical light. Beside it was a low-profile plate carrier, loaded with magazines. "Alva!" "No," Agent Blake warned, stepping forward, his hand drifting toward his jacket. "You cannot involve civilians in an active terrorism response." Alva leveled a glare at the federal agent that could have melted lead. "She's not a civilian, Agent Blake, and that hospital is her home. You want to stop me from giving my business partner the tools to defend her people? You're going to have to shoot me." Syra didn't wait for the legal debate. She moved with a fluid, terrifying grace that completely erased the exhausted nurse from existence. She stripped off her oversized scrub top, revealing a tight, sweat-wicking black undershirt. She strapped the plate carrier over her chest, the familiar weight of the ceramic plates grounding her. She checked the chamber of the rifle, the metallic clack echoing sharply in the tense room. "I know the hospital's layout blindfolded," Syra said, slapping a fresh magazine into the magwell and locking it in place. "I know the blind spots in the security cameras. I know the subterranean maintenance tunnels that connect the south lot to the ED basement. If HRT is 20 minutes out, I'm the only chance my staff has." Agent Jenkins looked at Syra, seeing the Silver Star recipient the files had described. "Miss Morris, if you go in there, you are operating entirely off the books. We cannot cover you if this goes sideways." Syra threw a spare medical blowout kit into a dump pouch on her belt. She looked up, her ice-blue eyes burning with a cold, relentless fire. "I've been operating off the books my entire life, Agent Jenkins," Syra said softly. "Let's go to work." The wail of the unmarked FBI SUV's siren tore through the congested Chicago streets, but inside the vehicle, Syra Morris existed in a bubble of absolute silence. She sat in the back seat, eyes closed, methodically box-breathing. Inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold. It was the same rhythm she used in the back of Blackhawks, over the Korengal Valley. Up front, Agent Blake drove with terrifying aggression, while Jenkins relayed the grim reality over the radio. "First shots fired," Jenkins shouted, her voice tight with adrenaline. "Multiple shooters at Street Jude's ED main entrance. Security is pinned down." Syra's eyes snapped open. The clinical, exhausted nurse was gone. The Tier 1 operator had taken the helm. "Pull into the east alley behind the oxygen tanks," Syra commanded, her voice slicing through the chaos. "There's a utility service door, bypassing the main lobby. It leads right into the sterile supply corridor. Chadwick won't know it's there." Blake drifted the heavy SUV into the narrow brick alleyway. Before it completely stopped, Syra threw the door open and hit the pavement running. The biting November wind whipped past her, but she felt nothing. She swiped her keycard at the heavy steel utility door. The light blinked green, and she slipped inside, the door clicking shut to seal her in the chaotic echo chamber of the hospital. The corridor smelled of bleach, freshly laundered linens, and raw panic. Through the double doors ahead, the distinct, terrifying crack, crack, crack of unsuppressed 5.56 rifle fire shattered the usual hum of the hospital, followed by the shrieks of the innocent. Syra raised her suppressed 300 blackout, SBR, the red reticle of the EOTech sight, hovering perfectly in her line of vision. She pushed the door open, just an inch. The main trauma bay was unrecognizable. Shattered glass from the entrance littered the linoleum. Medical carts lay overturned as makeshift barricades. Behind the triage desk, 3 of her junior nurses huddled together, weeping. In the center of the room stood Brody Higgins, wildly firing into the ceiling. "Nobody moves," he screamed, his voice cracking with panicked adrenaline. Syra didn't hesitate or shout a warning. This was a hostage rescue. She stepped fluidly through the doors. Pop, pop, 2 suppressed rounds, sounding like a heavy pneumatic nail gun, struck Brody's rifle dead center. The kinetic energy pulverized the weapon's receiver, violently ripping the gun from his hands and sending him sprawling backward onto the floor with a scream of shock. The junior nurses shrieked, cowering further, until they looked up. Syra? Maria, a young nurse Syra had mentored, sobbed in disbelief at the sight of her senior wearing tactical gear and wielding a suppressed rifle. "Keep your heads down, Maria," Syra ordered calmly, her eyes scanning the hallway. "Where is the leader?" "He went toward the ICU stairwell," Maria stammered. "He said he was going to make the doctors pay." Chadwick was heading for the most vulnerable patients. Syra stepped over a groaning Brody, kicked his ruined rifle under a bed, and sprinted for the stairwell. She climbed 2 steps at a time, her weapon leading her eyes. As she reached the second-floor landing, a heavy door crashed open. "Where is the chief of surgery?" Chadwick's booming, arrogant voice echoed down the dim ICU corridor. Syra slipped through the door. The ICU was a surreal nightmare, the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors contrasting with Chadwick's screaming. He stood near the nurse's station, his AR-15 leveled at a terrified doctor whose hands were raised in surrender. Focused entirely on his twisted power trip, Chadwick had 0 rear security. He was a weekend warrior who fundamentally misunderstood the reality of violence. Syra closed the distance in absolute, predatory silence. When she was just 10 feet away, she spoke. "You're holding it wrong." Chadwick froze. The voice was unmistakable, the quiet, emotionless tone of the nurse he had mocked at the gun shop. He spun around, trying to bring his rifle to bear, but his movements were sluggish and clumsy. Syra didn't even pull the trigger. She stepped inside his guard, her left hand striking the barrel of his rifle and violently redirecting it toward the ceiling. Simultaneously, she drove the buttstock of her weapon directly into his sternum. The ceramic plate in Chadwick's vest stopped the penetration, but the blunt force trauma was catastrophic. The breath exploded from his lungs in a wet gasp. Before he could recover, Syra swept his legs. Chadwick crashed hard onto the linoleum, his rifle clattering away. Syra planted her knee heavily onto his chest, pinning him, and pressed the hot muzzle of her suppressor directly under his jawline. Chadwick's bloodshot eyes widened in paralyzing terror. He stared up at the woman he had told to stay in her lane. He didn't see a nurse anymore. He saw the Grim Reaper in body armor. "You think this is a game?" Syra whispered, her voice colder than the ice outside. "You think buying expensive gear and bullying people makes you a wolf? I told you. I deal in life and death. You're just a tourist." Heavy boots pounded up the stairwell. FBI HRT operators flooded the ICU, weapons raised, lasers cutting through the dim light. They stopped short. The domestic terrorist was already neutralized, pinned to the floor by a woman in nursing clogs. Agent Blake pushed through the tactical team, staring in stunned silence. Syra slowly lifted her rifle away from Chadwick's throat. She stood up, engaged the safety, and slung it over her shoulder. Looking down at the whimpering man clutching his bruised chest, the Tier 1 operator vanished, and the senior trauma nurse returned. "Agent Blake," Syra said, her voice dropping back to its clinical pitch. "Suspect has sustained blunt force trauma to the sternum. Possible cracked ribs. He'll need a chest X-ray to rule out a pneumothorax." She reached into her dump pouch, pulled out a heavy-duty trauma dressing, and tossed it onto Chadwick's chest. "Take him down to triage. Tell them," Syra sent him, "I need to get back to my patients." The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated the night sky around St. Jude's Medical Center, casting long shadows against the brick facade. The crisis was over. The Iron Vanguard had been dismantled, not by a protracted siege, but by a single woman who refused to let violence dictate the terms in her sanctuary. Syra Morris sat on the tailgate of an ambulance in the cold night air, an EMT draping a shock blanket over her shoulders. The tactical gear was gone, locked securely in the trunk of Agent Blake's SUV. She was back in her faded blue scrubs. Alva and Daniel pulled up to the police barricade in Alva's beaten-up truck, rushing past the yellow tape to find her. When Alva saw her sitting there, safe and untouched, the giant gunsmith let out a breath that seemed to carry the weight of the world. She wasn't just a nurse, and she wasn't just a soldier. Syra Morris was the quiet, immovable line between the wolves and the flock, proving once and for all that true strength never needs to announce itself.